Her little hands bled every morning, but no one ever asked why. In the dusty village of Mbarika, everyone saw Amani's torn wrappers. No one saw her pain. They called her the rag girl. Children pointed at her patched skirt. Grown-ups whispered that she was a curse to beauty. But Amani didn't care about names. She had bigger things to worry about, like fetching water from a far-off well, barefoot, through thorns and heat, just to take care of her blind grandmother. Every drop she carried was a battle won. Her clothes were stitched from thrown-away fabric, old rice sacks, faded curtains, whatever she could find. While other girls wore pretty dresses on Sundays, Amani wrapped herself in whatever didn't fall apart. And still, she stood tall. No one knew how often she went to bed hungry, saving the last handful of maize for her grandmother. No one noticed how carefully she washed her only pair of socks at night, hoping they'd dry by morning. She didn't cry when they laughed, not even when someone shouted, "Go hide, rag girl," as she passed. She just kept walking, holding her chin up like royalty, because in her heart, Amani believed, maybe the world sees rags, but one day, they'll see what's really stitched beneath. She wasn't just a girl in torn wrappers. She was a dream waiting to bloom, quietly, stubbornly, in the red dust of Mbarika. The moment her skirt tore, the whole assembly ground to a stop. Amani felt it. The cold air hit her skin, and so did the laughter. Dozens of students pointed. Some clapped. Others just howled. It wasn't just a small tear. It was her worst fear coming true, in front of the entire school. She stood frozen, clutching the back of her skirt with trembling hands, trying to cover what little she could. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the noise around her. But the teacher's voice cut through everything. "Shameful," he said loud enough for all to hear. "You come to school looking like this?" The next words crushed her even more. "You'll never be more than a housemaid anyway. Sit down." Amani didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just sat on the floor, her eyes on the dusty ground, praying the bell would ring and swallow her whole. But the damage was done. That day, she learned something harsh. Sometimes the people meant to guide you will be the first to break you. Later, they took the class photo. The students stood in neat rows, smiling. Amani was there too, standing awkwardly at the edge, her skirt now pinned with a safety clip someone gave her out of pity. But when the photo came back a week later, she was missing, cropped out completely, as if she never existed. That picture hung on the classroom wall for years. Everyone was there, except her. Amani didn't ask why. She already knew. Her torn clothes didn't fit the school's image, and maybe her dreams didn't either. But what no one saw was that Amani still came to school every day after that, in the same patched skirt, with her books wrapped in old newspaper because she couldn't afford a school bag. She sat in the back, took notes, listened, even when her classmates teased her, even when her teachers ignored her hand raised in class. She never stopped believing that she was more than what they said, more than her skirt, more than their photo, more than a future they tried to shrink down to house chores and shame. That classroom didn't break her. It built her, brick by painful brick, because the same girl they cropped out would one day stand in front of cameras, microphones, and lights, not as someone edited out, but as someone the world couldn't stop looking at. Amani's life began to change the day she found something broken, just like her. She was cleaning trash near the old market, looking for empty bottles or metal scraps she could sell for a few coins. Her hands were dirty, her back sore, and her stomach growling. But then something caught her eye. Hidden under torn cardboard and plastic, there it was, an old, rusty sewing machine missing a wheel, with a bent needle and dust all over it. Most people would have walked past. But Amani's heart skipped. She didn't know why, but she dragged it home, piece by piece. It was heavy, and her neighbors laughed when they saw her. "What will you sew, rag girl?" "More rags." But she didn't answer. She just smiled and kept walking. That night, after feeding her grandmother and washing her hands, she sat in the corner of their tiny room with only a candle flickering beside her. She touched the machine gently, like it was something precious, something alive. She didn't know how to sew. She had never used a real needle before, but she started anyway. At first, she practiced on rice sacks and torn curtains she found in the garbage. She stitched with old threads, pulling them out of worn clothes. Her fingers pricked often. Sometimes they bled. But she kept going. She didn't have a real doll, so she made one from a broomstick, wrapped it with cloth, drew a face with charcoal, and called it Hope. Every night, she made new dresses for Hope, using nothing but scraps and imagination. Some nights she stayed up until the candle melted to nothing. The shadows on the wall looked like runway lights to her. She imagined applause, models walking, her name whispered in crowds. Not Rag Girl, but Amani the designer. Nobody saw those nights. Nobody saw the girl with thread and fire in her fingers, sewing dreams into torn fabric. But something was growing quietly in that room. Not just clothes, not just talent, but purpose. One evening, her grandmother touched a dress Amani had made and smiled. "You stitched this?" she asked. Amani nodded. Then your hands are magic, child, the old woman whispered. That was the first time anyone had ever called her work beautiful. It wasn't just a sewing machine anymore. It was a lifeline, a key, a secret door out of shame, out of silence. Each stitch was a small rebellion against everything she had been told, about who she was and what she could never be. Amani didn't have money. She didn't have fancy tools. But she had something stronger, belief. A tiny, stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, the world had been wrong about her. And that broken sewing machine? It didn't just mend clothes. It began to mend her future. Amani's hands were shaking as she laid out her dresses on a small wooden table in Ngozi Town Market. They weren't fancy. They were made from rice sacks, old bedsheets, and curtain scraps. But each one held hours of work, stitched carefully by candlelight. This was her first time showing her designs in public, and her heart pounded louder than the market noise. She stood there, hopeful, wearing one of her own pieces, a long patchwork dress with sunflower patterns drawn by hand. Some people passed by with curious eyes. Others just walked past like she was invisible. Then came the laughter. A group of women stopped in front of her table. One of them picked up a dress, turned it over, and burst out laughing. "You call this fashion?" she said, loud enough for others to hear. "This looks like something a scarecrow would wear." The others joined in. "Who would buy rags stitched from trash?" someone asked. "This isn't fashion, it's just garbage with buttons." Amani felt her cheeks burn. Her fingers clutched the edge of the table so tightly, they turned white. But she didn't cry. Not there. She simply smiled and said softly, "Thank you for stopping by." After the crowd moved on, she almost packed up and left. Her dreams felt crushed beneath their laughter. But just as she reached for the dresses, a soft voice interrupted. "Did you make these?" She turned to see an old woman with a camera around her neck. Her skin was pale, her eyes kind. "Yes," Amani said, trying to sound confident. "They're special," the woman said. "Very raw, very real." She took a few photos, asked Amani's name, and left with a quiet smile. No promises, no big words. Just a click of the camera and a goodbye. Amani walked home that evening with a heavy heart. Maybe they were right. Maybe fashion wasn't for girls like her. Maybe dreams stitched from scraps never reached the runway. 2 weeks passed. Then one morning, while she was shelling groundnuts outside her house, a neighbor ran up to her, waving a phone. "Isn't this you?" she asked, shoving the screen in Amani's face. It was her dress, the one with the sunflower pattern, posted online. Thousands of likes. Comments from people all over the world. Words like genius, raw beauty, fashion with a soul. The photo the tourist took had gone viral. Amani stared at the screen, speechless. She hadn't even known what viral meant. But now people from Paris, Lagos, and Nairobi were asking, "Who is this girl? Where can we find her work?" The same dresses they laughed at in the market were now being praised by fashion lovers across the world. Amani smiled, not because she was famous now, but because she didn't give up. She had been rejected by her village, mocked in public. But destiny? Destiny saw something different. And sometimes, all it takes is one photo to show the world what the mockers missed. Amani was sitting under the mango tree, her legs stretched out, a bowl of groundnuts in her lap. The sun was hot, and her fingers were dusty from shelling. It was a slow, quiet afternoon in the village, just like any other. Birds chirped, kids played in the distance, and the radio from the next compound hummed a love song. Then her old phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. The screen showed a strange number with a +33 country code. Maybe it's a scam, she thought, but something in her heart told her to answer. "Hello," she said softly, holding the phone like it might bite. A clear, confident voice responded. A woman with a French-African accent. "Bonjour. Is this Amani?" "Yes, speaking," she replied, her heart starting to race. "I'm Maëlle from Elle Afrique magazine. We saw your dress, the rice sack gown, the one with the hand-stitched yellow flowers. Is it really your design?" Amani sat up straight, nearly dropping the bowl in her lap. "Yes, I made it." There was a short pause on the other end. Then the woman said, "It's beautiful, powerful. We've never seen anything like it. Do you have more pieces?" Amani blinked fast, trying to hold back tears. She looked down at her feet, still dusty from the morning's walk to the well. Her dress was one she'd stitched herself from 2 old pillowcases. No makeup, no manager, just a village girl under a tree. "You saw it all the way from Paris?" she whispered. "Yes," Maëlle said warmly. "The photo someone took in the market, it went viral. Our editors in France and Nigeria have been talking about it all week. We want to know your story. We want to feature you." For a moment, Amani didn't speak. She couldn't. The world had always felt so far away. Paris was something you saw in movies. Eiffel Tower, runways, shiny lights. Not something that called your phone in the middle of shelling nuts. She finally found her voice. "I don't have much. I stitch by candlelight. I use scraps. Old clothes. But that's what makes it magic," the woman said. "We see the soul in your work." Amani's eyes welled up. She thought of the people who once laughed at her, the ones who said she'd be nothing, the teacher who cropped her out of the photo, the woman who mocked her designs in the market. And now, El Afrique was calling her from Paris. After the call ended, Amani sat still for a long time, the phone resting on her lap. She looked up at the sky. It was the same wide sky she'd grown under. But now it felt closer. Like maybe, just maybe, the world had opened a little crack for her. She wasn't just the rag girl anymore. She was the girl who answered the call, and the world had finally dialed her name. When Amani told the village she was applying for a visa to travel abroad, laughter filled the air louder than the evening drum. Visa? For who? Someone shouted from across the road. You think your rags will pass airport security? Another neighbor joked. Even the shopkeeper, who once gave her thread on credit, chuckled. You're going to Paris or to pick plastic at the airport? Amani smiled quietly. She'd heard worse. After all, these were the same people who once called her a curse to beauty. But deep inside, she knew something had changed. Her work had reached places she never imagined, fashion magazines, big cities, powerful eyes. With trembling hands, she filled out the visa application. She had no fancy documents, no designer portfolio, no travel history. Just a letter from El Afrique, a few printed photos of her designs, and a heart full of hope. She went to the capital city by bus. It was her first time leaving her region. She spent the night on the floor of a cousin's tiny apartment, holding her papers close like treasure. The next morning, she stood in line at the embassy in her best outfit, a neat dress she had stitched from a faded wedding tent. Her shoes were secondhand, worn thin at the soles. People around her wore suits and heels. Amani clutched her bag tightly and prayed. When the officer called her name, her knees felt weak. She stepped forward, hands slightly shaking. After a few questions, the officer looked at her papers. Then at her. He paused, then reached for his stamp. Thud. Visa approved. Amani stared at the stamp for a moment, unable to speak. Tears blurred her vision. She stepped out of the embassy and walked straight to the roadside to call her grandmother. Mama, she whispered into the phone. It's done. I'm going. Her grandmother didn't say anything for a while. Then she whispered back, God sowed this path just for you. The day she left, a small crowd gathered, not to send her off with love, but to watch with doubt. Let's see how long she lasts, someone muttered. 1 week and she'll be back. Amani climbed onto the old village taxi with one small bag. Inside was a single gown, her proudest piece, stitched from leftover wedding tent fabric. She didn't have a suitcase. She didn't need one. At the airport, she looked out the window of the plane and saw the clouds for the first time. Real clouds, big, white, and soft like cotton. She closed her eyes and smiled. She wasn't just flying to another country. She was flying out of every insult, every doubt, every cruel laugh that ever tried to clip her wing. Amani was still wearing secondhand shoes, but now she was walking a first-class destiny. The lights were blinding, the music loud, and the crowd full of cameras and expensive perfume. This was Cape Town Fashion Week, and standing behind the curtain, heart pounding like a drum, was Amani. She held a small notebook in her hands, filled with sketches drawn by candlelight back in her village. Her dress was simple, made from dyed curtain fabric and hand-stitched beads. No designer label, no big team, just her story, woven into every thread. The models lined up beside her. Tall, elegant, powerful. Some wore gowns made from rice sacks. Others had dresses made from scrap denim and mosquito net. But every piece told a story, her story. The announcer's voice boomed. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the debut collection of Amani, the girl who stitched her dreams. The music started. The first model stepped out. Gasps filled the room. Not because of glitter or drama, but because the designs were raw. Real. Every dress looked like a piece of someone's soul, stitched with pain, but glowing with hope. One had a pattern that looked like a water well, with blue beads dripping down the skirt, symbolizing Amani's daily walks for water. Another had yellow flowers on rough fabric, honoring her grandmother's laughter in the middle of hardship. Backstage, a model who had been quiet all day suddenly sat down. I need a minute, she whispered. Her makeup artist rushed over. What's wrong? I heard Amani's story, the model said through tears. How she made a doll out of a broomstick. How she stitched clothes with bleeding fingers. How everyone laughed at her, and now she's here. She fainted moments later, not from the lights, but from the weight of inspiration. Meanwhile, Amani stood frozen, peeking through the curtain as the audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the hall. Some were crying, others were filming, but everyone felt something. This wasn't just fashion, it was a mirror of survival, stitched by a girl no one believed in. When the final model walked the runway, wearing Amani's most personal piece, a gown made from her old-school uniform, torn and reimagined into royalty, the crowd lost it. Phones flashed. People stood. One designer in the front row clutched her chest and whispered, "This is what fashion should be." And then they called her name. Amani, come to the stage. She stepped out slowly. Her hands were cold, her eyes wide, but her smile was steady. As she walked the runway, people reached out to shake her hand. Some bowed. Some just cried. Amani didn't have to say a word. Her clothes had spoken for her. Her pain had become power. Her story, once laughed at in dusty markets, was now lighting up one of the biggest fashion stages in Africa. From torn wrappers to runway lights, she had stitched every step of the way. The sun had barely risen when the magazine arrived at the village kiosk. Wrapped in plastic, fresh from the city, it was the new issue of Vogue Africa. The shopkeeper opened the bundle slowly, not knowing that he was holding something that would stop the entire village in its tracks. There, on the cover, was Amani. Her face filled the whole page. No filters. No makeup to hide the truth. Her braids were neatly tied, and the tiny scar above her left eyebrow, once mocked as ugly, was proudly visible. She wasn't smiling. She didn't have to. Her eyes said it all. Above her head, bold white letters read, "The Resilience Issue, from rags to royalty." Words spread like wildfire. Did you see it? That's Amani. Our Amani? The rag girl? On Vogue. Soon, a crowd gathered at the kiosk. Women with water buckets, men on bicycles, school kids in uniforms. They all stopped to stare. Some tilted their heads. Some said nothing. But no one walked away. One woman touched the cover gently. "This is the same girl who wore rice sacks to school," she whispered. Another shook her head. "I told my daughter to stay away from her. I said she was cursed." Now the same people who once laughed at her wrappers, who called her worthless, stood silent as her image looked back at them, powerful, unbothered, unedited. Inside the magazine was a full feature. Photos of her first runway show. A quote about her grandmother's strength. A picture of her old sewing machine, still broken but now framed on her studio wall. One page showed her designs, gowns made from waste, each one named after something she overcame. Water Walk, the cropped-out girl, Hope and Thread. But the most powerful part? A paragraph where Amani said, "I didn't want to look rich. I wanted to look real. My scars are part of the design." Back at her old home, her neighbor stood at the gate, staring at the photo. She remembered the time she threw out an old curtain, and Amani had picked it from the trash. That same curtain, she later realized, had become the base of the dress that went viral. The children, too, now asked, "Mama, is it true she lived here? In this same village?" And for once, the answer came with pride, not shame. Yes. She came from here. Far away in a city hotel, Amani sat on a balcony, flipping through the magazine herself. She smiled at the cover. Not because of fame, but because everything they tried to hide, her background, her scars, her poverty, was now the very thing that the world celebrated. The village had once frozen her out. Now they were frozen in place, staring at the face they tried to erase, now shining on the front page of Vogue Africa. When Amani stepped off the bus back into her village, the wind felt different. This time, she wasn't carrying a basket of laundry or a bundle of rice sacks. She wore a simple, elegant dress she had stitched herself, soft blue, with golden thread shaped like tiny sunrise. Her braids were tied back neatly, and a rolled-up blueprint peeked from her bag. People stopped and stared, but not like before. There were no whispers of rag girl or mocking laughter, just wide eyes, some with guilt, some with awe. But Amani hadn't come back to show off. She came back to build. At the far end of the village, there was a field full of dry grass. Years ago, kids had gathered there to laugh at her clothes and throw stones at her broomstick doll. She remembered standing there, holding back tears, clutching her torn wrapper like armor. Now, she stood in that same field with an architect, builders, and a small sign that read, "Stitch of Hope, Sewing School for Girls." The ground was cleared. Bricks arrived. Villagers watched silently as walls began to rise where weeds once grew. And Amani? She helped every day, measuring cloth, painting chairs, even teaching the workers how to thread a needle when they got curious. When the building was finished, it was nothing fancy, just 2 large rooms with tables, stools, and donated sewing machines. But the walls were painted with bright flowers. The windows let in sunlight, and the words above the entrance were written in bold. "Your past is not your prison." On opening day, girls lined up, some barefoot, some shy, most unsure. Amani greeted each one by name, offered them a needle, and said, "Your hands are enough." Inside, she taught them not just how to sew, but how to believe in their own ideas, how to turn old fabric into art, how to take what the world throws away and make something beautiful. One girl stitched her first skirt from a rice sack and ran home screaming, "Mama, look what I made." Another cried when Amani held up her dress and said, "This could walk on a runway." And the best part? Amani never charged a coin. She said, "When I had nothing, someone saw me. Now I want to see you." Even the women who once laughed at her now came to learn, wrapping old headscarves around their shame. One whispered, "I'm sorry for what I said back then." Amani smiled and replied, "Let's stitch something new." The field where she was once mocked had become a place of healing, a space where rags turned into dreams, where laughter was no longer cruel, but filled with joy and learning. Amani didn't return rich. She returned purposeful, not to stand above them, but beside them, because the girl they once mocked had become the woman who built doors for others and handed them the key. The sun was high when Amani saw a familiar face standing quietly at the gate of Stitch of Hope. It was her old teacher, the one who once laughed when her skirt ripped, the one who told her she'd never be more than a housemaid, the one who had her cropped out of the class photo. Now he looked different. His shirt was faded, shoes dusty, eyes tired. He held a file in his hand and avoided her gaze. Amani walked up slowly, heart steady. "Sir," she said gently. He looked up, surprised. "Amani," he whispered. "You remember me?" She nodded. "Yes, I do." There was a long pause. Then he spoke again, voice lower this time. I'm looking for work. I used to teach, but school's closed. No one is hiring. Someone told me you run this place." Amani looked at him, not with anger, not with pride, but with a quiet kind of strength. "We do need someone to help with record keeping," she said, "and mentoring the younger girls with reading and writing." He looked shocked. "You'd hire me?" She smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance." He started the next day. He was quiet, respectful, and always early. The students didn't know his past with Amani. They only saw him as another mentor. Weeks later, Amani held a staff meeting. She took a group photo of her team, standing tall, arms around one another. This time, she was the one holding the camera. And when the photo was printed and hung on the wall, the teacher stood right in the middle. Not cropped, just seen, just forgiven, just humbled, because that's what real power looks like, not revenge, but grace.